Before starting, I'd just like to acknowledge the First Nations people and their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for our use of the lands on which we are located today. I personally am located on Wadawurrung land, and three of our other presenters are located on Wurundjeri land, I think. Yes. And so we thank them for the privilege of being able to use the land in this way today. I'm Dr. Ian Warren. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at Deakin University. And this is a panel, if I can just get my slides up and running. I'm the chair of this panel, and the panel is dealing with, I hope I've got the right one. The panel is looking at harmful structures, silenced voices, decolonisation, abolition and repair, which is quite a mouthful, but the basic summary of the four distinct papers that we're presenting today is that the structures that contribute to the harms that we're going to talk about are all broken. And we all come at that discussion about the broken nature of the structures from very different perspectives. I'm taking a historical approach. Emma, who is looking at tasers on trains, is looking at the failures of policy and the failures of policy to analyse itself, which has led to this crazy function creep that we're going to experience in Victoria next year. Tatiana Corrales from the Health and Social Care Unit at Monash is looking at again a very broken set of systems associated with child protection and the disproportionate targeting of Indigenous kids within the current child protection milieu. And Scott will look at Scott Welsh from Victoria University and the University of Melbourne will look at the intersections of human and non-human and animal captivity based on autoethnographic work that he's been writing on for several years now, and it's based around issues relating to homelessness and the structures associated with homelessness. And so with that introduction of the panel, I'll get started. My topic is on questioning jurisdiction, territory and space. I don't want to labour the point about jurisdiction too much because I could get into a very extended and boring literature review that I find very interesting, but you will all find very boring, because what you really want to know is what I'm going to say about the data that I've been looking at. I've got three key objectives in the work that I'm doing that extends well beyond this snapshot presentation. The first is to examine the localised forces of early police jurisdiction in Victoria and how those were carceral in nature, keeping in mind that we've got completely different historical demographics that were associated with the spread of white settler colonialism within Victoria. There's obviously the issues associated with private land holdings and dispossession of Indigenous people, the colonial violence that was occurring. But on top of that, I also want to look at the values that were associated with the concept of crime, because these things meant very different things from what they do today, and they also had varied implications in different locations within Victoria. And so issues related to jurisdiction are not just conferring legal power on police, it's looking at other ways in which jurisdiction was taken up or resisted by agencies or by communities and so forth. So that leads to the second question: how does jurisdiction emerge, not just through law but through market and social forces, and what are the dynamics of those forces that are available within existing archives? And the third question is, how do we make sense of these issues given the ongoing and persistent repetition of problems that characterise the misuse of enforcement jurisdiction today? And I think we can talk a lot about that misuse, which is being mentioned in other presentations that I've seen anyway. But I think that, and to share an issue that Emma, Ryan and I have talked about quite a lot, it's frustrating as criminologists that we can acknowledge a problem, but the problem keeps persisting. And this is a set of intergenerational problems, we think, in terms of the way in which police jurisdiction has exercised not only destructive, but in some cases it's been inept activity. Sometimes it's set itself up to fail, and I'll show some examples of where it's done that. My major source is probably one of the most boring sources you can get fascinated in. Really, it's called the Victoria Police Gazettes, and these started in 1855, and they were weekly. So, and it's kind of like a crime dossier of crimes unsolved, crimes that had been reported to police, and so police were advertising within the gazettes the nature and the character of the crime, because they couldn't actually have the capacity to solve much of it. So the police gazettes there were 52 editions per year from 1855 to the 1920s, and I'm slowly working through the 1850s and the 1860s to get a sense of the profile of what police were reporting, the nature of what they were reporting on, and in particular, I'm very interested in location, coming from Geelong or Wathaurong country, where you've got a lot of regional areas that have settled, farming territory outside of Geelong. I'm moving my focus much more towards rural and regional criminology than I am the urban, because let's face it, the urban is totally out of control and lawless. So we might as well get some sense of the way criminology and policing works in the rural context. I'll also put in some speculative musings along the way, because this is, for me, this is kind of a little bit of a personal project, but it's also a culmination of a lot of work that I've been doing in terms of governmentality and policing research. So I'm finding it incredibly fascinating, and it's building for me as well on really important work by Lisa Ford, looking at settler sovereignty in the US and Australia, and Mark Finane and Heather Douglas and their work on Indigenous crime and settler law. So I'm very heavily influenced by those works. What I'm finding is I'm getting a real sense of what colonisation actually involved. And it wasn't just a question of taking over the land and kicking people off it and so forth. There was actually a really sophisticated governmentality. And if we go back to the basics of where that governmentality developed, that governmentality was English. So because we're working within a context where Victoria was a penal colony for quite a long time, we're also working within a context where the London Metropolitan Police had only been in existence for 25 years. So that organisation was actually finding its feet. And there was a lot of governing at a distance that was happening from London, but then adapting to local conditions in ways that I don't think we understand, and historians have painted patchwork pictures about this in the past. So I'm using the policing narratives to actually reconstruct what that policing narrative might look like from a 21st century lens. And here's some themes that I'm picking up. The first theme is this constant preoccupation with territorialisation and deterritorialisation. Now, part of that is land takeover from Indigenous people, but it's also about construction of new versions of what that land meant. And so I'm going to give you some very dense lists of things that I'm not going to read out, and I'm certainly not going to insist that you read them from the slides, but it gives you a sense of the scope of what the territorialisation was occurring. And in the process, what it was doing was deterritorialising the Indigenous lands. So jurisdiction, particularly in Western legal jurisprudence, is predominantly based on territory. So what was happening was these micro policing jurisdictional geographies that were being formed, and they were very, very, very important and prominent within the policing material of the time. The second issue, and again, it sort of highlights the boredom and trawling that you go through with a lot of this work. There's a lot of administration. There's tons of it. And this is about building modern statehood. policing was not just about crime control, it was about oversight of various forms of public service provision. So it was about meatworks and food, it was about the distribution of fuel. I found that fascinating. I thought people were just cutting down trees and burning them to keep warm, but apparently there was a really sophisticated sense of how to distribute fuel so that people had enough to get through winters. Liquor licensing, obviously, which is a contemporary function, but that began in the 1850s. And I think also, given that micro sense of control over these various forms of Western culture, it was very difficult for policing organisations in the state to exercise carceral control over Indigenous people unless they crossed into settler life. And so that's not to excuse a lot of the malfeasance that was going on, but what I'd put that down to is neglect. Essentially, they shut Indigenous people out unless Indigenous people came into white territory, in which case they became governed by white law. Other than that, it was lawless, in which case that explains a lot of the atrocity that was going on. Then on top of that, you've got determining and responding to various types of crime, and I'll give you some indications of those. And finally, the issue of delegation, and I found this fascinating in terms of the idea of tickets of leave. So convicts, after they'd served a period of time that was determined by the English state, were then under local law, which was still governed by England, but it was administered here, were entitled to a ticket of leave, which was kind of like parole. They were given a land plot. They were allowed to exercise that land plot, but they weren't under that constant 24/7 surveillance. But it's kind of like the modern day version of, or the historical version of the modern day practice of electronic tagging, except they had passports. So the ticket was actually a physical ticket, and they had to show that on demand, whether when a police officer or a member of the public asked to see it, until they were finally pardoned once they'd completed their full sentence. Now, the issue of naming I've found incredibly fascinating, because all of the suburbs that we know today actually had a police presence. And in fact, many of the rural areas also had a police presence rather than being divided into divisions. You had the basic 19 divisions as they were depicted in 1855, but within those divisions, every location that is mentioned there had some sort of police presence, and that was a 24/7 police presence. So this is inimical to the idea of what settler colonialism was about, and keeping in mind that that's also building from an ex-convict presence as well. So we're moving from true convict period into much more free settler time. And this massive devolution of policing authority throughout all of these different locations. Only 2 of these locations are metropolitan Melbourne. Most of these are, the remaining 17 are regional. And what's happening is they keep adding to them. And this is fascinating. So as more settlers start to come in and more settlements are being produced, they're just adding more police to the system, which is just, when you talk about this in 21st century language, it doesn't make any sense, because 21st century language is all about devolution. It's been about removing state resources and removing police resources and consolidating police stations and removing the police stations from the small local communities because they're inefficient and economically unviable. This is the exact reverse. It's about state building. And so policing becomes a central conduit to that, and a central marker of that sense of community building under white settler rule. Now, within this, you've also got the issue of defining crime. None of this should surprise. I'd say 70 to 80% of the crimes that are listed in the police gazettes relate to theft of some sort. It's either horse or cattle stealing. Housebreaking was very, very prominent. And the further I'm going into the 1860s and 1870s, housebreaking and stealing from dwelling houses increases markedly. There's 2 reasons, I think, for that to happen. One is you don't have registered locksmiths. and in fact the property and physical property was very, very insecure. And the other was you had itinerant populations, particularly during the gold rush period. So people were moving, and most people that were mobile were living in pubs. So they'd spend a week in a particular pub, then move on to the next public house, which is why they were the called hotels. So there was a lot of itinerancy. You got lost property and stolen property. The other variable that kicks in here is that people seem to be very willing to report their property as being lost or stolen, because that's what the police are going on. They're going on reports from members of the public. Escaped convicts, which is very common, which is also a testimony to the issue of carceralism and how that was being played out at the time. You've got desertion from Her Majesty's service, mainly people in ships, particularly in the Geelong area, where they were coming to the Geelong port and then nicking off. Missing persons, a lot of reports on missing persons. Felonies that aren't otherwise described but then kick in later on as separate categories. So this comes up under the miscellaneous information. Desertion, child destruction, and indecent assault, they all eventually become their own independent categories. So there's a governmentality as to the way in which these categories form based on what police are receiving as being the significant issues of their time. I've just gone through Geelong and Warrnambool at this particular point because they're of primary interest to me. But all of those policing districts that I mentioned earlier and policing locations have reports in these weekly digests that then become annual digests and so forth. So my numbers are fairly small, but I'm keeping it confined. And as time goes on, you get more crimes that are being reported in these areas because people are more willing to report them. Indigenous criminality and Indigenous issues are hardly reported at all. And in fact, in the early days, in the 1855 edition, for the entire year, there's only 4 reports of Indigenous people in the entire 400 pages of material that I've been through. Most of the reports are actually coming from the New South Wales Police Gazettes and are being syndicated back into Victoria. The further you go on, the more you see that where Indigenous people are assimilated into Western life, they become more visible within these documents. So these are history, the Indigenous history I'm not prepared to tell because I don't know it. I'm only going by what the documents are saying, and the documents are actively excluded because Indigenous people didn't have personhood, as I understand it, under those times. But when they came into white society, they actually were visible within the records. And they're visible in 3 ways. One is as victims. So the first one, we've got a case of a murder of an Aboriginal named Charlie. He is integrated in some sense because he was a shepherd. So he was working for someone, and they've got a very detailed depiction of the accused. William Wright, about 5 feet 7 inches high, about 30 years of age, light brown hair, sallow complexion, which I would have imagined applied to many white settlers of the time. Sharp featured. There's a biological determinism thing going on here, and it's really, really important because this predates photography. So if these are wanted ads, as what the police gazettes are kind of like, then the thick description of the individuals becomes really, really important to understand in terms of shaping the way in which law enforcement was occurring. The other thing that's significant in this case is the rewards, and rewards are everywhere. Police were getting rewards for their own work that led to a prosecution or a conviction. So the reward system was very much alive and well during this period. The second context of Indigenous people being mentioned was escapes from custody. I find this last phrase quite interesting and ironic. Both of these men wore jail clothing consisting of a blue shirt, moleskin trousers and a Scotch cap. If I was an Indigenous person escaping from white police custody, I'd get rid of that clothing pretty quickly. And I would assume that the police knew that that was what was going to happen. So they're very much putting out a plea for help that they probably know is not going to be heard. The third is as perpetrators. And considering that in some contexts we were looking at what was actively declared as war. There were massacres and all that sort of thing. This one is much more contentious, and I want to highlight the contention around the language used, because what we're talking about here is speculation. Two people were found dead, or reported as having been murdered by some Aborigines of the Gippsland tribe. Now, if you extrapolate back to the detail that was associated with the white person who was accused of murder before, you've got this sort of generic otherizing that's going on within the language here. And what's even more troubling here is that this is almost encouraging vigilante behaviour. So a reward of £20 for such information as will lead to the apprehension and conviction of the murderers. The othering is so distinct that, in fact, it doesn't matter who the murderers are as long as they get to Aboriginal people or any Aboriginal people. And I think that's preempting genocide, essentially, because there's no science behind this. It's just that they've done this, and it's problematic, and we need to administer some sort of justice. Each page of each of these documents contains about 60 records of crime, and that's why I'm narrowing this down to particular geographies. But what I'm trying to do also is understand on my own terms, and in light of the literature that I've read, about what the implications for decolonisation might be from what I'm seeing in these documents and in the reports about crime and policing activity. My first conclusion so far is that, in principle, police were only concerned with Indigenous people when they appeared to impinge on white definitions and redefinitions of geography and criminality. Outside of that, whatever went on was not reported. So, and that means we need to get creative with understanding the history and understanding what the genocidal behaviour was that has led to the situations that we're in today. This is why that policing cannot be viewed as a protective institution for Indigenous people. You just can't view it in that way, because what it was preoccupied with was white settler activity and mainly property theft. And even then, it was pretty impossible for them to enforce the law to the letter. And so the second conclusion is many of the investigative functions were doomed to fail because they were based on property offending that led to self-help, insurance, locksmiths, and a whole lot of other governance arrangements when it was found out that the police couldn't do it because their clearance rates were impossible to adhere to. So all the police could do was be conduits to get the message out that stuff had been stolen, but they couldn't actually ever retrieve it because it was just too labour intensive or difficult to enforce. If we extrapolate that today, 7% of burglaries get cleared by police. So it's not a surprising statistic. I think it's even worse during that time period. And what happens is that the police failures become gateways to new forms of regulation. And that in turn leads to specialisation such as administrative and licensing laws and the various benefits and problems that they produce. What we need is creative construction and reconstruction of historical voices. Indigenous voices need to be present in those reconstructions, and they need to be able to do it in a self-determining way. But we also need voices of victims, offenders, in-depth histories of crime types, and so forth. And what I am strongly advocating is the police gazettes are a window into this idea of jurisdictional expansion and contraction, because not all of these jurisdictions actually lived and survived over time. And it's also a window into understanding the appropriation and control of geographic space, including rural and urban transitions, surveillance, management, and carceral processes. So that's my contribution there. Did anyone ding me? I didn't hear it.
I did ding you, but you're only 2 minutes over time.
Soz.
I turned my mute off. I don't know why you didn't hear it. Anyway.
Soz.
Hopefully I hear yours.
That's all I've got. Our preference, given that this is a panel, is to just roll straight into the next presentation. So I'll now introduce Emma Ryan, who's going to talk about tasers on trains. And we'll reserve questions for the end, I think, but feel free, if you're connected online, to type in questions as you go, and we'll address them towards the end.
Thanks so much, Ian. Just bear with me while I get this happening. All right. Everyone hear me? All good? Yeah. Great. Thanks so much. So my name's Emma Ryan and I'm a colleague of Ian's, a lecturer at Deakin University. Did my PhD on the introduction of tasers into Australia, which I completed in 2012. So this paper is, and since 2012, I've actually been sitting here in Victoria waiting for developments to occur. Victoria has actually been very slow on the uptake of tasers, which is very interesting for those of you who are familiar with the kind of cultural history of policing in Victoria. Let me see if I can help you understand a little bit more about what has passed and also what is coming down the track. So very quietly on the 23rd of December last year, 2 days before Christmas, the Victorian government put out a press release announcing that they would be providing tasers to all operational police in Victoria. This is a really big shift, and I'll explain this as the paper goes through. So my purpose today is really to talk us through and talk myself through how did we get here, and to kind of sketch out the carceral nature of tasers, the capacity of tasers to control the body, makes it a really unique weapon. And for use of force scholars who like to talk about use of force continuums, etc., tasers are actually a very confounding weapon because they slide up and down that use of force continuum so readily. And this is, in my view, a very concerning reality, considering that the proposal, well, not the proposal, the announcement is that protective service officers will be armed with tasers, which is something that I think we should interrogate closely. Why PSOs need tasers? Just because, evidently, there's no actual rationale or reason why. PSOs have been charged with assault on a number of occasions, but as far as I am aware, have not had to resort to the use of their firearms, which they do carry at this point. So if tasers are a replacement for firearms, then it's a little bit confusing. So yeah, I want to frame the problem, as I've mentioned, as a kind of a slippery slope into what I'm starting to think of as kind of electro control and punitiveness. I want to talk about what the plan in Victoria looks like, what some of the pitfalls of that plan are, and just some of the implications and some of the things that as scholars and activists and other interested parties we need to look out for. So the key point to understand about tasers for people who are not so familiar with them is the number of ways in which they can be used. And as I mentioned before, this means that they're extremely difficult to actually put on a force continuum. Very few policing agencies place tasers next to or even just below firearms anymore, even though, you know, as we would all be familiar, the general rationale for the introduction of tasers and capsicum spray prior to that was to reduce the use of firearms. This hasn't happened in Australia and hasn't happened in the United States or anywhere else. In fact, in some jurisdictions, firearms use has increased since the introduction of tasers. The reason I think that tasers need to be taken very seriously in the context of the slippage from critical incident to just carried around on a train platform is because of this element of threat. And because of how little we know about what the implications, for instance, around psychological distress for a person who is threatened with a taser, whether that means what is colloquially known as red dotting, where a taser will shoot a little red laser beam out and actually target on somebody's chest, whether the taser is arced so it can be fired without actually deploying the darts and it makes a nasty crackly electrical noise. The reality is that internationally, tasers are drawn and used by police in that threat mode overwhelmingly more often than they are deployed with an actual intent to control. Much like firearms, tasers need to be used in a manner that's proportionate to the threat as the law dictates. But because of this number of ways in which you can use your taser, it's actually very difficult for courts to determine whether, you know, a taser has firstly resulted in a fatality. That's a whole other paper, which I'm not going to go into right now. But secondly, whether that it has actually been proportionate to the threat faced. So that's important to know. Tasers can be and are pointed at people. They're threatened much more often than they're actually deployed. Policing agencies are now at the point where they will proudly proclaim this point and willingly admit that actually tasers are really great for controlling and coercing people. That's what they're really good for. We just have to point them at people and people comply. And that's fine. Well, it would be fine if we could trust all police to use their judgment correctly. This slide is illustrating the slow creep into, and I want to stress this, specialist policing. Tasers were introduced firstly in Australia only to critical response police because they are considered appropriate for replacing firearms or potential use of firearms in critical incidents. Victoria, once again, was a little bit slow on the uptake, even here, waiting until 2003. The taser, what shall I call him? Peddler, that's not very good. The person who supplies tasers to people in, or to police agencies in Australia, you might not be aware, is actually an ex-Special Operations Group member of Victoria Police. I'm not sure that he owns the distribution company anymore, but he certainly did during this time. So he had a very close ear within Victoria Police, and Victoria Police have been quite cautious because tasers carry a whole lot of operational challenges. You have to hit a person with those two barbs with a certain amount of distance in between them in order for the electrical charge to actually work. Tasers miss and are ineffective far more often than they are actually effective. So in Victoria, homing in, we can see that they were trialled in the Special Operations Group in 2003 and very quietly just introduced. Similarly, a trial in a number of regional stations was, in fact, that's my next slide, was held in Victoria in 2010. And then again, very slowly, the general rollout, very little publicity, very little conversation about this. In 2005, the Office of Police Integrity reviewed the Special Operations Group use, and you'll see by that little excerpt from their report there that the weapon was actually not used terribly often. So my point here is, if specialist police are not using them all that often, what is the rationale for giving them to protective service officers on trains? It's extremely concerning. The OPI was, in fact, in that 2009 report, argued that it was very unlikely that widespread deployment to general operations police would happen in Australia, let alone Victoria, because they felt that to deliver the training was impractical, read that as expensive, complicates decision-making. Of course, there's been several very sad occasions of what is called weapons confusion, which you might or might not have come across, where officers have pulled out their firearms instead of their tasers, and sometimes vice versa. The OPI said that carriage is impractical, to say the least. If you have a look at the number of weapons on police belts these days, it'll be interesting to see where General Duties Police in Melbourne actually do carry their tasers. I suspect it'll be at the top of their vest to prevent that weapons confusion. And the other concern was around injuries, of course. So where are we? Yes, so trialled in a couple of regional areas, and I believe from Bendigo and Morwell, it then moved on to other regional areas. with coincidentally high Indigenous populations. By 2018, all 24-hour regional stations carried them. And as I mentioned, they've now been announced, and you can see the police minister's framing of why we need these non-lethal weapons so badly. They're in the bottom red square. You can also see the announcement by Victoria Police in their corporate plan, which as a taser scholar makes absolutely no sense to me. Gangs, counterterrorism, violent extremism, cybercrime. I'm not sure tasers are that helpful. Anyway, so they're rolling out this essential equipment, and also at the same time, they're going to suddenly make all of the cultural problems better at the same time. All right, what's happening overseas when tasers are carried by people who are not as highly trained as police? Leaving aside the use of tasers by police, which is incredibly problematic as it is, the use by PSOs is problematic. The police commissioner of New York police in 2012 rejected the idea, saying it was a shockingly bad idea. His concern was mostly around the propensity of tasers to be abused. And to move into what we call function creep or mission creep. I did a quick Google search of PSOs and assault. I was actually looking to see how many PSOs had been assaulted, but this is what I found. You can see that I didn't find anything. It was them assaulting other people. So with the poor cultural history in Victoria, the broken accountability mechanisms in Victoria, which I don't need to report to most of you, my own knowledge and many other people's lived experience of policing in Victoria sends up red flags. More importantly, as a scholar of police use of force, I have no access to any kind of usage data. So I can't actually report to you how often tasers have been used in those regional areas. All of the figures I can get are over 10 years old. And that is something that I'm working with some community legal centres around to try and address at the moment. I'm just going to leave you with a very quick, and this is a little bit distressing, but I think it illustrates function creep, and it helps to really frame the concerns that I have about the things that we might see down the track happening on railway stations or indeed even on trains.
Good evening. The actions of two police are under the microscope tonight for pulling their tasers on a Gold Coast father in front of his terrified wife and daughter.
The officers were at the home to follow up on a traffic ticket when the situation exploded.
Consider a time to offence or obtain a record of 5 years.
It starts out as a run-of-the-mill traffic infringement. This Parkwood father asking officers to prove he was driving unlicensed.
When you see it, show me.
Then all hell breaks loose.
Stay here, you're under arrest.
He's backing away, unarmed, his wife standing between the constables and her husband. But within seconds, a taser is drawn.
Do not shape up to us. It's get on the ground. Get out of the way. Move out of the way. Mate, you're under arrest. Put your hands down. Get out of the way with them. What? Leave her alone. Get out of the way. You can't be
The female officer tries to calm the situation.
This is just an infringement, mate. She does need to relax.
The couple's horrified daughter comes outside, a taser still pointed at her dad, before a second is drawn.
Leave your hands on there. Leave your hands on there.
Relax.
Move this way. Move this way.
Cuffed and put in the gutter, the man's wife continues to plead his case.
It was a ticket. It was a ticket. And I was acting. Grow up.
I thought she paid it. I said to her, pay it this morning before I went to work.
The man was charged with obstruct police
Like it's not assault police or something just like that.
and driving while unlicensed. Both offences thrown out in court today after police failed to provide their brief of evidence. The family lawyer says police went too far.
My client thinks that the police acted totally inappropriately pulling a taser on a young family just for a traffic offence is just not justified in the circumstances.
Jessica Millward, 9 News.
Gosh, so just one small example of something that I see unfolding, particularly for fare evasion and also other very low level offences. So this is something that, as I've mentioned, we need transparency. We need to be on guard, and the community legal centres certainly are. So in case you didn't know they were coming, be aware, make sure you've topped up your marquee.
Good evening.
Oh,
The actions of
hang on, don't do that.
police
Go away. Oh, no, hang on, we've had a malfunction. There we go. Thanks so much. Questions at the end, as we said.
Thanks, Emma. I'll now hand over to Tatiana Corrales, who is presenting on punishing trauma, child protection, risk, and the control of motherhood.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Emma. Need to note that I'm at home with a child with gastro, so if I have to turn off my camera very, very quickly, I do apologise. And Ian, you can take the reins for me from there on.
Thanks, Tat.
My pleasure. You'll do an outstanding job, I have no doubt. Okay, so I want to begin with acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the Bunurong and Wadrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands on which I live and work. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people who are with us here today. I acknowledge that this land sovereignty has never been ceded, and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I start, I just want to make a quick note on some of the language that I'll be using throughout my presentation today. I'll be using the term mother and women, or mothers and women, throughout the presentation. This is not to exclude non-binary and gender diverse people who are caught up in the child protection system. Arguably, although we have no data that looks at this issue specifically, non-binary and gender diverse people experience even more layered and complex problems when they come into contact with these systems. I'm using the terms mothers and women to reflect the discourses, the dominant discourses within the child protection that surround these categories in particular. I do acknowledge, though, that that is quite exclusionary and it's an area that requires much further research. So the focus of my presentation today is on the way that the child protection system in Australia acts as a site of punishment, in the way that it controls and tries to manage or define what constitutes appropriate or normative mothering and motherhood. We know that the child protection system is an inherently colonial construct. Its origins date back to the start of settler colonialism, and it is grounded fundamentally in Puritan values. At the start, at its very inception, one of the core aims of the child protection system was to assimilate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children into white society. I put up a paper that's recently been published by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Tatiana. This is based on her PhD research, which looked at cultural connection amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the Victorian child protection and out-of-home care systems. And what she's argued essentially through her work is that despite various ways that First Nations communities have tried to resist the assimilatory aims of the child protection system, they continue to find themselves in a constant battle where child protection expands and its intrusion into First Nations families and communities becomes ever more punitive and ever more violent. And I'll touch on that shortly. The child protection system in its more contemporary form is very much grounded in neoliberal assumptions about childhood. So fundamentally, childhood is equated with an inherent vulnerability that needs to be protected. It's grounded in assumptions about normative expectations of mothering and parenting that deeply reflect white middle class values, belief systems, resources, capacities and opportunities. And it very, very fundamentally reflects a responsibilized notion of parenting. So parents, and particularly mothers, are held responsible not just for the harm that is allegedly caused to the children, but also for enabling that harm or not stopping that harm from occurring. It is, pardon me, at the moment, The child protection system, particularly in Victoria, is fundamentally failing families, particularly First Nations families. And we see this through various different strategies that have been employed by the state. There was an introduction of amendments to the Children, Youth and Families Act, which is the child protection legislation in Victoria in 2016, which significantly curtailed judicial discretion around what orders can be made and the conditions that can be included in those orders. We see that there's a narrative and a discourse around reunification being the ultimate aim of the child protection system, when in fact rates of reunification are around 34% for all children in the out-of-home care system in Victoria, similar for Indigenous children as well. And we see that there's been this massive push towards what the child protection system and child protection policy calls permanency, which is most often achieved through removal and placement with alternative carers outside of the family. The final way that we see that the child protection system in Victoria perpetuates punishment and is a site of punishment is in the very limited provision of support that is offered to families. Once a child is removed from the family's care, families are essentially left on their own. So this is just a really, just want to give you a quick visual representation of the way expenditure in the child protection out-of-home care system in Victoria is broken up. The red and the yellow lines are intensive family support services and family support services. The aim of these services is to either stop children from being removed, or once they are removed, to support families to work towards reunification. What we see throughout the last 10 or so years is that in Victoria, only 11% of the total expenditure on the child protection system has gone towards intensive family support services, from a low of 9% to a high of 11%. In contrast, we see that investment in the care services, that's out-of-home care services, has always been around the 50% mark. So this, to me, indicates where the priorities of the government lie. Rather than investing on keeping families together and supporting families to reunify, the bulk of expenditure goes on maintaining and expanding the out-of-home care system. Out-of-home care is an extremely expensive system to run. It becomes even more expensive as you have more children entering the system and staying for longer periods of time, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And it's a trend that could be very easily reversed if the equation was upended. So if instead of focusing on building up the tertiary end, we focused on the prevention side, I think we'd see massive savings to government. So in terms of the focus on Victoria specifically, I won't harp on about this too much. What I do, and I do recommend for people who haven't read the Snake Family Matters report, please access it. It's available online. For anyone who's interested in the persistent and gross overrepresentation of First Nations children in the child protection system of all states and territories throughout Australia, the Family Matter reports the Family Matter report provides a really glaring and harsh representation of the impacts of child protection intrusion into First Nations. Across the board in Victoria, there were 45,465 children who were in receipt of child protection services between 2020 and 2021. That includes children who were, or families who were referred, so not notified and then referred out to support services, all the way through to children who were subject of investigations, who were placed on care and protection orders, and subsequently removed into out-of-home care. One of the most interesting and terrifying trends that we're seeing over the last few years is a number of infants and young children being entered into out-of-home care. So infants are children under the age of 12 months old. We see that there were 2,312 infants and young children, so 0 to age 4, entered into out-of-home care 2020 and 2021, and 337 of those were under the age of 1. What we also see is that the disparity. So this graph is about all the age groups in out-of-home, admitted to out-of-home care in Victoria. We see that there are huge disparities between First Nations children and non-Indigenous children across every single age group, from birth all the way through to 15, 17 years old. We see that in 2020 to 2021, First Nations infants, were admitted to out-of-home care at a rate of 109 per 1,000 children. And that compares to 6.3 children per 1,000 children who were non-Indigenous. So that's a huge, huge discrepancy. And in fact, Victoria has the highest rates, the second highest rates of infant removals across Australia, second only to WA. So this difference speaks to a whole range of things, primarily systemic racism and the colonial history and ongoing coloniality of the child protection system. But I think it also speaks to the way that risk is defined within the contemporary child. I also just want to put this graph up. It will make a bit more sense in the context of the subsequent, the next slide. But the child protection legislation in Victoria defines three categories of abuse. So it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and those are the main categories that can be used. So what this graph shows is that last year, between 2020 and 2021, the most prominent type of neglect that was substantiated was emotional abuse. This is it. We also see, as per my previous point, consistent discrepancies between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and non-Indigenous children across all abuse categories. But if we focus specifically on emotional abuse, we start unpacking some of the issues within it. Emotional abuse is one of the most difficult forms of abuse to substantiate. It involves psychological abuse, it involves emotional harm, degrading or humiliating behaviour, and also parental neglect of a child's emotional needs and their emotional development. What has become increasingly apparent, though, is that emotional abuse is also a category that captures exposure to or experience of family violence. So what we see in this graph is that children in Victoria are being removed primarily because they've been exposed to or have experienced family and intimate partner violence, either by parents or by siblings. So what does all of this mean? Well, in essence, what we're dealing with is a system that positions mothers as failures. They position mothers as deviant, as dangerous, as risky, through this discourse of failure to protect. And again, this is where the emotional abuse statistics come into play. When a mother has a child removed for failure to protect, the discourse that's being weaponized against her is that as a victim of family violence, she has failed to put her children's needs and her children's best interests ahead of her own safety by failing to protect those children from being exposed to family violence. And that in itself creates a risk that warrants child protection intervention and ultimately removal. The other thing we see in these cases is that when women are essentially coerced by the system into leaving these violent relationships, but they leave those violent relationships primarily and often into homelessness, which is then again punished as evidence of negligence, as evidence of risk, and as evidence of deviance and an inability to protect their children from harm. What the child protection system currently and historically has always failed to consider are the structural and systemic factors that impact on the families that come into contact with those systems. It's a system that punishes financial hardship and poverty. It's a system that punishes mental ill health. It's a system that punishes disability. It's a system that punishes families that very often are trying to do the best they can with the resources that are available to them. And we know this because the data, both Australian and internationally, shows us that the people who are the women who are most likely to come into contact with the child protection system are First Nations women. In the United States, it's Black and Latinx women. It's women with extensive histories of trauma, including intergenerational trauma, women who have experienced homelessness, women who have significant mental health difficulties, women with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities, women who've experienced violence, interpersonal violence, institutional violence through incarceration predominantly, and systemic violence, women with histories of substance misuse, and most tellingly for me, it's women who were themselves removed and placed into out-of-home care. And in fact, having been in out-of-home care is one of the strongest predictors of having a child removed in Australia. I'm running out of time, so I might run through this really quickly, but one of the case examples that I've come across through some research I was doing previously at Melbourne University is the way prenatal child protection works in Victoria. So unlike other jurisdictions in Australia, the child protection system in Victoria doesn't have statutory authority to commence an investigation during pregnancy. What they can do, however, if there's a notification made about an unborn child, is they can try to engage with a pregnant woman, refer her to relevant services and supports, and then once the baby is born, they can initiate an investigation to see whether the child is removed. All of this can only happen with maternal consent. What ends up happening, though, is that the women who are at most risk of having an unborn report made to child protection are women who are already under extensive surveillance. And so they hesitate in engaging with antenatal services, which is itself seen as a risk factor for child protection involvement and infant. So what do we know? We know that hospitals are mandated to make prenatal notifications to child protection. We know that child protection is alerted when a baby is born where there's been a notification made. We know that child protection gets involved very, very late in women's pregnancies, typically within weeks of their expected due date. We know that they offer very little support or services, and even the limited support or services that they do offer is ineffective because by the time child protection gets involved, women have no time to address the protective concerns before their babies are born, and so they risk having their babies removed at birth. And we know that women are not supported following the removal of their children after birth. So they are expected to navigate both the child protection system and the support service system without any kind of supports offered by child protection.
1 minute, Tatiana.
No, all right. Thanks, Ian. So where do we go from here? I think first and foremost, the primary thing we need to do is to have a very explicit acknowledgement, particularly by white advocates and scholars, that the child protection system causes harm. It is designed to cause harm. It is punitive, it is risk averse, and it targets certain types of families and communities. And so in response to that, what we need is a complete redesign of the system, not a reform of the system, a redesign. One where self-determination for First Nations communities is central and is implemented in a way that reflects true self-determination, not what we're seeing with the Victorian government at the moment, which I can get into during question time. We need a strong focus on families, not this idea that somehow children are decontextualized from their families and their environments. We need greater investment in prevention and early intervention, but again, not through the current models. We need to really start addressing the structural and systemic inequities that are contributing to some of the harms that we're seeing within and beyond the protection system. And we need much greater transparency and accountability from government. We collectively have vested government with the power and the right to intervene in families and to remove children. They need to be held accountable for the consequences and the impacts of those actions. For anyone who's interested, here are some resources that I strongly recommend. The Europe Justice Commission is currently holding hearings. They're focusing this week on the criminal legal system. Last week was on child protection. I strongly recommend for people who have time and are able to listen to some of the evidence the testimony that's been provided by First Nations people impacted by the systems. Upend is also an amazing organisation with heaps of resources based in the US, but it really does speak to family policing and the harms of family policing. And finally, Dorothy Roberts' recent book, Torn Apart. Again, provides a lot of really important information on how an abolitionist perspective can help us address the harms of family policing. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Tatiana. Now the final presentation by Scott Welsh, which is titled The Intersections of Human, Non-Human and Animal Captivity. It's all yours, Scott.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Tat, and thanks, Emma. So my paper is titled Becoming Mush the Hobo Cat, and it's about the criminalised self that occurs in the experience of homelessness. And I sort of explored this idea through the question, how can an artistic work that represents the relationship between human and non-human animals benefit cultural criminological approaches to homelessness? So this research is concerned with utilising cultural criminology, particularly the work of Corrales, to construct an autoethnography that explores direct lived experiences of homelessness. The social scars of homelessness are reflected upon or considered through the stray, abandoned and carceral experiences of my cat. The result of this reflection has been a play that will be performed at La Mama Theatre in 2023, titled Mush the Hobo Cat. And it draws attention to recent sociological discourse on the performance of social actors in pandemic spaces, where the securing of boundaries, speciesism, and speciesism in the biocultural geography of infection are practiced by relevant authorities and are comparable to the social control of homeless people. Beyond this social and cultural, social and historic pandemic context, the criminalisation and carceral responses to homelessness generally will be explored, and ultimately the question of what can be learned through creative practice will be considered. So just a bit of background literature. The experience of homelessness constructs an identity that internalises carceral responses to socially deviant people. Ironically, these responses attempt to practice social control over behaviours that they cannot understand or empathise with. The self is transformed and criminalised by experiences that are often beyond the control of the individual, and the dehumanisation of disposable people or human trash is internalised by the person who is being disposed of, and socially transgressive behaviour follows due to engagements with transgressive cultures, which destroy and then remake one's subjectivity and social identity. And so this paper is an autoethnographic exploration in the form of a reflection on a creative process. The theatrical production, as I said, explores the cat, his desperation, criminalisation, and incarceration. The remaking of his subjectivity has mirrored my own journey from homelessness and criminalisation to emancipation. A recent presentation at the Centre for Post-Colonial Studies invited homeless groups, advocates, interested people, researchers, and members of the centre to launch a film based on the experiences of those considered homeless during the COVID pandemic, who were locked down in motel rooms to protect society from individuals who were perceived at that time as vectors of transmission. Various presentations at the launch opened our eyes to previously hidden and somewhat dark worlds of crime, drugs, hygiene, and populations of people in excess in our society, unwanted and ultimately criminalised, convicted, and locked up. During lockdown, populations of homeless people were rounded up and confined to makeshift carceral spaces where they were subject to excessive surveillance, not applied to the broader population. Further to this, from my own perspective as one who experienced long-term homelessness and carceral treatment in the welfare system in the past, I found myself triggered by these stories, and one permanently on the City of Melbourne website that describes a homeless man named Chris. I am Chris. I have been Chris. The story presented on the City of Melbourne website is one that I know in my body. The social worlds he inhabits, the places he describes, I've been there. I sat next to the ice dealer who threatened me with a knife while I passed out my poetry to passers-by as a beggar. In this paper, I'm going to talk about my cat. And I'm going to try to attempt to fill a gap in the legal and criminological literature by using my 15-year experience as a visibly homeless person who engaged in petty criminal activity to build on existing secondhand accounts of policing and regulation through the critical lens of lived experience of the homeless person, using a theatre practice I call real fiction. This responds to recent quantitative data on homelessness and proposed educational interventions. What we know is that the formal regulatory environments are extremely alienating when one does not have clean clothes, hygiene, or the social and cultural capital to participate as a citizen. So rather than responding directly to the discourse outlined above, I'm going to give an account that might appear to be in the tradition of autoethnography, using a creative, almost surrealist, absurdist method of creating this, where I imagine a degree of agency for my cat that borrows from but is separate to the animal liberation movement and the idea of animal studies. Whilst this research is concerned with a cat's experience, it is not animal studies, nor is Mush the cat a metaphor for my own experience of homelessness. Rather, it is a study of a relationship formed in the creative practice of real fiction, a creative method I have used for decades as an artistic practice, creative research, as an educational tool, as research, and then in collaboration with colleagues as a practice in tertiary classrooms to subvert perceptions of academic learning. In the context of this paper, I'm using this artistic practice to consider the experience of homelessness as a cultural criminological phenomenon. Often when eating, he will look around like someone's going to swipe his dinner. Eating has brought with it a fear association. Homeless people live in fear of having their few possessions stolen or removed by authorities. This precarious subjectivity has social and cultural consequences in terms of how one conceives of oneself and how one is perceived by others. See, in the lower echelons of the new working class, being the class dependent on welfare, I forgot to change my slides, welfare as well as working just to pay rent. Pets come and go, especially cats. It's been a long time since I've felt that sense of entitlement that comes from being middle class. I've felt the injustice of being deprived in a way that perhaps my comrades have not. Maybe they never had it in the first place, or maybe they never fell all the way to the bottom of hell, tortured by demons, real and imagined. Maybe when you're born oppressed, it's different. I can't really speak on behalf of all cats, or stray cats, or lost cats. This is an observation about the cultural life of the oppressed, the population that has been called disposable people, or redundant population. These are the people for whom capitalism has no place or purpose. I had been one of these, so had Mush the cat. So just the final sort of part of my paper talks about solidarity and literacy. So I'll just finish with that, okay, and skip some of the other aspects. Whilst recent literature seeks to challenge singular constructions of homeless identity, it is perhaps also important to realise that it is a common experience that is shared by oppressed groups within society. This has the potential to create solidarity and mobilise masses within which individual empowerment may occur. It is my view that this can be processed through a conscious and concerted effort to raise literacy levels among people experiencing homelessness. I claim that this can be done through Paulo Freire's technique of social and cultural literacies, where we come to master our own dialect before mastering the dominant one. We need to understand ourselves, our own experiences, our common ground with those like us. Then we might become who we really are, fulfill our potential. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott. I guess we now open it up to questions from both the floor and online. And so happy to take any questions as they come through, and perhaps they could be moderated at the Melbourne Uni end, so that because I can't see who's asking what.
No worries. Can you hear me okay? Ian, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm happy to pass the mic around to anyone in the room if there are questions, but there are a couple of things in the chat. Mark asks, with wealth of information and fatigue, are there plans or work in progress that is working towards a better future for incarcerated and policed folks, especially First Nations people? So I'm not sure, Mike, if that was directed towards a certain presenter or if it's something for the panel to consider. For the panel, okay. Yeah, Mark says it's for the panel to consider.
Who's gonna start?
I won't.
Oh, well, I mean, from my point of view, in terms of, taser regulation, the work in progress is to keep the pressure on Victoria Police to actually publicly report. And, if it's any consolation, I won't rest until that happens. So it's very difficult to, obviously address these things full on. We have to work around the edges. And the first thing, as I say, with taser use is transparency, of which there is none. And I think that might be similar to your subject matter, Tatiana.
Yeah. And so in my space, I don't know how directly impactful this is going to be, because again, it's one of those areas where there's not much political will to do much. But I'm working on a project around incarceration, pregnancy and childbirth and child removal amongst women who are incarcerated. So the intention there is to at least start getting some information out there into the public domain about the harms that are being perpetrated against incarcerated women, predominantly First Nations women, by the Victorian prison system, and how the criminal justice system and the child protection system intersect in these women's lives. There's always a push by myself and my colleague, Jacinta Cracker, and a couple of other researchers at the University of Technology, Sydney, to just keep hammering the point again and again and again about the impacts and the consequences of child protection intervention into people's lives, not just First Nations, but particularly First Nations. So I don't know if that answers your question, Mark, but I think it's an unending process.
I think from my point of view, there's a real sense that we need to actually think about what police jurisdiction is. And so I'm choosing to go down the historical pathway because I want to find out more about where the origins of it came from. But I'm also convinced that a lot of contemporary police jurisdiction, apart from the regulatory processes that set it up, have been conferred on the police by accident because they're the only 24/7 organisation that can do it. And a common example of that is traffic control. Now, police are actually quite good at traffic control when things are going well. They're also pretty good at homicide because they chuck a lot of resources into it. But certain other areas of jurisdiction, they're pretty hopeless at. And I mentioned the issue of burglary clearances, for example. Now, I think we need to think carefully about what we do in terms of police jurisdiction, because unlike the US, it's much harder here to conceive of an abolitionist movement against the police entirely, because they hold so much jurisdiction over so many different areas and many of those I mentioned in my paper. And so what we probably have to be more realistic about is taking bits and pieces of jurisdiction away from them rather than conceiving of the Victoria Police Abolition Act. I can't see that happening anywhere near as readily here compared with the US because of the municipal nature of policing in the US. It's actually easier to get rid of police forces over there because you can just defund them straight away. Whereas here it's a lot more complicated. So my tactic with this is to chip away at different aspects of jurisdiction. Any other questions? Someone in the chat has asked, and that was Mark actually. I don't think I heard the word abolition mentioned in Scott's paper.
Oh, did they say that? Is that about me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess what I was trying to do in that paper primarily was to talk about how crime comes from experience and from diverse experience, and that one of the ways that we can intervene in crime is by understanding diverse experience better and accommodating for diverse experience. And in that respect, maybe it's about prevention then in relation to crime and abolition. Yeah. Does that help?
There was also another question from Mark in the chat. Mark says, I'm concerned calls for transparency will never be achieved, given police and cages have never shown an interest in this, and their operations depend on secrecy. Curious to know why you think transparency will be achieved. Again, I'm not sure if that's towards the panel or towards someone.
I'm happy to dive into that one. Thanks for the question, Mark. It's a really good question. Transparency is obviously difficult to achieve, but I can speak very precisely to the question that you ask in Victoria, because the fact is that if you go to New Zealand, if you look up New Zealand police and you Google their taser use statistics, you will find them publicly facing. The same is true in the United Kingdom. Same is true for the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So I've just recently published a book chapter, which will come out next year, which is my tactic, Mark, is to basically shame, starting with Victoria Police, because police across Australia are more or less transparent, but unsurprisingly, Victoria Police is the worst. Whether I'm successful or not, I don't know, but holding up international standards and saying, hello, we're not a backwater here. Can we actually, meet the same reporting standards that other, Western liberal democracies have, at the very least? I'm hoping that I have faith that ultimately we will get transparent reporting of taser use, at least in Victoria, which is only a small part of the pie, but quite an important one, I think.
What's very ironic is that my work directly contradicts what Emma is experiencing in terms of the knowledge about policing, because the police gazettes are full of information about what police did. And what's happened over time is that there's been this massive increase in secrecy. Police view public criticism as in terms of responding through paranoia and closing the shop and so forth. So I think, and Tatiana's presentation speaks to the same thing, because the agencies are scared of public criticism, because they're within their own bubbles saying, well, we're doing the right thing here, but no one can actually penetrate those bubbles and be able to get access to basic data that we should all require. And so on that basis, I think history actually tells us quite a lot, because there was that level of transparency in ways. And it's not complete transparency, don't get me wrong, because there's certain things that are absent from the historical records as well. Just the basic practice of recording things and making them publicly available and engaging the public within the accountability processes. Those things I've been doing policing related stuff for 30 years and they've just been constantly deteriorating. And I think unless we mobilise and use that as a force for pushing forward, the same processes of secrecy are just going to continue. And the only time we actually see criticism about the police is when they kill someone. Well, that it's kind of too late then.
Yeah, I agree. I struggle with this notion of transparency, Mark, so thank you for your question. I'm not convinced that we will get to a point where transparency is achieved, but I agree with Emma's approach that it's about shaming. It's about getting whatever information we can and whatever format we can out there that really shines a light on how abusive and violent these systems are. And maybe it's a naive belief, but I think that if more people in the community knew what was happening, we might get to a point where enough of us are galvanized into action and enough of us are putting enough pressure on politicians to make meaningful change. I don't know that that's going to be the way forward, but I also know that without enough of the mainstream community being on board, we're never going to be able to shift these dialogues. We're never going to be able to get more transparency, let alone accountability. So for me, it's about shaming, but it's also about raising awareness amongst the broader community and trying to disrupt these narratives that somehow people in these systems don't deserve to be treated with basic decency, that they deserve to be punished just for existing. So that's my approach, but I don't know, guess we'll see. I've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I think that's great, Tat, because it's also, you know, what you made me think of was sort of feminism and queer theory, you know, and other places where we've had broad social change in attitudes, you know, and so we can maybe do the same thing here. Yeah.
There's a risk though. There's a risk of co-opting other voices that need to be prioritized. So I think, you know, I think we need to amplify voices of the people who are agitating for change, you know, and that's why I keep bringing up the Europe Justice Commission. That may end up being just another report that gets filed away and nothing ever happens. But the testimony of the First Nations people that have come before that commission to date is so powerful that if there's anything that the rest of us can do to amplify that and to chip away at those issues in whatever capacity we can, and that's appropriate and not, you know, trying to take over, then I think that that's our responsibility. That's what we need to do. Sorry, I have a child screaming for me.
Any other questions, either from the floor or online?
We've got a question in the room.
Hello. Yeah, cool. Thank you. My name's Demia, the policy leader at Change the Record, or a First Nations Justice Coalition. I've got a question for Tatiana. Thank you for your paper. It was really useful and helpful. I really liked your comparison of the breakdown of that budget expenditure on child protection, and I'm pretty sure in Victoria that those overall budget spends on child protection have been going up over time. I'm wondering if you'd be able to reflect on why those breakdowns have remained stable when the volume of expenditure has gone up. It's a really boring question, but I'm interested in what it means that governments maintain those breakdowns.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of factors that have come into play. One of it is that the family support system has, in terms of its size, has shrunk. And at the same time, the out-of-home care system has expanded. So while it looks like they've remained stable in terms of the proportion of expenditure across those four levels of the child protection out-of-home care system, what we're actually seeing on the ground is a contraction at the intervention end and an expansion at the tertiary end. And so that appears to level things out when in fact the opposite is true.
Thank you.
Make sense? Yeah.
I've just provided a written response to Yolanda's comment relating to the fact that if you've got more transparency, it's contingent on the police reporting on themselves, and there's a number. In fact, there's PhDs to be written on the different types of accountability that you can have, but the real problem is to try and open it up so it's not police having the monopoly over the material that they're putting out there. And there's various models for doing that, which are, and again, I think, you can draw on some of this through history as well to see what's happened in history. And again, I think one of the shames with a lot of this stuff is that we know what the problems are now, but we don't necessarily know why we've got to this particular point, because the histories have been very, very fragmented, or they've only been done at very generalist levels by certain scholars such as Mark Fernane. So I think we need more detailed histories about how police were accountable. Has anyone, Emma, have you got a comment for Fern?
Oh, look, I mean, I can't disagree at all. I mean, of course, that's a problem. The accountability structures are broken. They're fully broken. I would just leave with a little, very brief anecdote. I failed to mention that I worked at the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission for a bit before I came to Deakin, and at the Office of Police Integrity. Just as the Office of Police Integrity transitioned into IBAC, there was a memorandum of understanding to be put in place between OPI and VicPol around biannual reporting of taser use. IBAC came along and kiboshed the whole plan. That memorandum of that MOU is still sitting in IBAC's repository, and I will be working to that's what we'll now. Yolanda, you're right. Police are never going to report accurately, and the oversight body can only look at what files police hand over. So there's all that's a universal in police scholarship everywhere. But if the oversight body were to put sufficient pressure on Victoria Police to report taser use transparently, at least that would be a better place than where we are now. So there is some hope. It's a long project, but I'm on it. As soon as I can, well, I don't want to get out of the classroom, but if I had a bit less time in the classroom, I'd probably be having more time for that. Don't think Deakin Vice Chancellor's listening, so I might just hush up now. Thanks, everyone. Great papers, and thanks for everyone's attendance too.
Yes, thank you. And I hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of the conference.